Welcome, everyone, this evening. Welcome to this evening's event titled The Role of Media in Building a Better Chicago. We're joined this evening by Edwin Eisendrath and Mary Mitchell from the Sun-Times. I'm Chuck Kaiser, General Manager of Edwin Chicago's Corporate Affairs Group, and I've been on the MPC Board of Directors for nearly 2 years now. It's been a great experience, and I value this organization that I'm sure the same way that you do for its contribution to shaping the future of the city of Chicago. For those of you who may not be familiar with Edelman, Edelman is a communications marketing agency that helps clients contemplate their reputations and promote, protect, and evolve them over time in this broad changing media landscape and marketplace. Each year we actually study this notion of trust, which I'm pretty sure is going to come up as a corollary to the discussion today, this evening. And albeit media as a general entity faces real headwinds in terms of its body and of trust in this era of fake news, et cetera. And the notion in the same study of trust that we've done actually has seen a recent spike in the value of the journalist. And so this evening, I think it's a completely appropriate the way we have the caliber of members of the journalist community to comment and stand for the power of the Fourth Estate in Chicago and beyond. Which brings us actually to the real talent. We're thrilled to sponsor tonight's event featuring Edwin and Mary, and the topic that we're talking about is very near and dear to Edelman, which is a Chicago born and bred company. And we're certainly eager to hear Edwin and Mary's thoughts shortly. Special thanks to Revolution Brewery for their beverage sponsorship and to Can TV for filming tonight's event. We ask that you continue the conversation beyond tonight's event. You'll notice some conversation starters around the room. Share your thoughts with us on social media. You can tweet us at Metro Planners or using the hashtag #ThinkAndDrink. That's think, letter N, drink, right? Okay, got that? Without any further ado, let's get right to it. I'd like to introduce our guest for this evening. Edwin Eisendrath led the effort to save the Chicago Sun-Times from being purchased by parent company of Chicago Tribune and is now CEO of Sun-Times Media, which includes Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Reader, of which I'm an avid reader, and the online news site, The Straight Dope. Edwin brings to that a role of lifetime of civic engagement, including serving as an alderman, regional director of housing and urban development, and of course, you know that gives with him a deep understanding of the city and a deep passion for it to deliver the news to the people of Chicago and Illinois. We're also joined by Mary Mitchell, whose obviously reputation precedes her tremendously as an editorial board member and columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, recipient of numerous journalism awards, too many to mention here, but I'll just go with the short list, including Award of Excellence from the National Association of Black Journalists, the Studs Terkel Award from the National Community Workshop, the Peter Lisagor Award from the Chicago Headline Club, Herman Kogan Media Award, and in 2011, Mitchell was inducted in the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame. To kick off the conversation, we will want to show a quick video from the Sun-Times. No? Oh, are you sure? Yeah, later. Later, okay. Well, I'm going to give you the parental warning now. It has some chutzpah, and in an era when in some cities they're battling to keep a one newspaper town, I just got to say it's outstanding that we still have multiple daily newspapers in our city that are committing itself to the existence of the Fourth Estate and getting the news to us, and so that's a tremendous thing. And you know, the competitive spirit by which the Sun-Times operates is greatly valued. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Edwin.
Well, thank you very much. And first, I want to thank the Metropolitan Planning Council for giving me this opportunity. How often do you get to interview your boss? So that's awesome. And so I wanted to start off by really talking about the first time, well, before we get to the first time you walked into the newsroom, what made you decide when newspapers all across the country are struggling to make it work, to make a dime, trying to satisfy their investors, and people are running and flocking to social media for their news, what made you think and want to buy a newspaper?
Yeah, my kids, who are young adults, think the paper product is the delivery mechanism for the dog bags. Really. They don't read it. And so let me start to answer that seriously by first asking you, how many of you are subscribers to the Sun-Times? Okay, that's maybe 15 of 150, right? How many of you care about Chicago? Okay, so I think there's a gap there, and an important one that we should talk about. For the 12 years before this opportunity happened, I worked overseas mostly, and by the food in the back, fabulous, and most of my work was in the Middle East. I love that food. And I watched the 2016 election mostly from overseas. Imagine. Like lots of people, I had post-election trauma. Not because Donald Trump won or a Republican won, but because there seemed to be a lack of a shared base of facts anymore. And that is essential for our democracy. And you guys want to talk about how you make policy, how you make policy to make communities better. And somebody asked me before the conversation, I really am interested in that conversation about how the news can help further the policy discussion. And I said, I'm going to be depressing. And I want to tell you that without a shared base of facts, when all facts are only true to the extent that they reflect your partisan judgment, you cannot ever have a policy discussion that matters. Cannot. So I was terrified for our democracy. And the New York Times is a great newspaper. It's behind me on the wall here. So is the Washington Post, a great newspaper. But throughout the Midwest, it's not really trusted right now. You know, news from Washington and New York and Boston, doesn't matter how good it is, it doesn't feel like it's going to be trusted here. And that goes to what America thinks of elite, and this elite and everybody divide. And this predates Donald Trump. You know, it goes back to the 1970s, because for the 40 years before it, the economy grew 90%, and that growth was largely shared in wage growth, which also went up about 90%. So the bulk of America shared in the growing economy, right? Left out of that equation, of course, were African Americans who weren't allowed FHA loans. So it's not completely true, but a large chunk of America shared in that growth. But from 72 on, the economy grew 70+%, and wage growth went 9%. That huge gap. And that happened all over the country, and for reasons that many people argue are good reasons, to make the economy global, more efficient, reduce costs so I can have an iPhone, whatever the reason is, it has consequences, right? But people trusted the news organizations that said the deal's a good deal. They trusted the economists, many from the University of Chicago, who said this is how we should do things. They trusted politicians who said, yes, we really should have these deals and make the world work this way. And then 2008 happened. And in 2008, well, Chicago's still underwater from 2008. People lost their homes, they lost some of them their families, and we didn't come together after 2008. And some of you have heard me say this at lunchtime, some of you were there. You know, in the 1930s when we were suffering, Woody Guthrie ran around the country with his guitar and he sang, this land is your land, this land is my land. And we looked at each other and we shared some sense of the burden together. And in 2008, we had Iron Man, rich guy saves the world. Right? And so people felt really angry, loved the movie, right? felt really angry. And so by the time 2016 rolled around, trust was gone. Trust was gone. Then candidates could say, oh, that's the New York Times. They don't represent you. Didn't matter the quality of the journalism. And they did that a lot, because when you start to have that lack of trust, then actors can step up who benefit from tearing us apart, right? And sometimes that's politicians, sometimes it's racists, sometimes it's hyper-partisan think tanks, sometimes it's Russian spies, and sometimes it's news organizations, right? Because greed's a powerful thing. So why did I want to come to the Sun-Times, right? Because in that atmosphere, right, I thought about where is a news organization that does not pretend to be elitist, that it doesn't aspire to be the New York Times. And I remember that when I grew up in Chicago, the Sun-Times was on the seat of the taxi driver next to you, or in the cab of the crane operator, or in the break room in a factory, or in a teacher's lounge. It had the backs of working men and women, period. And that's who we want to be. And I think if we go back and put together a news organization with that as its DNA, and we shrink the realm of politics back where it belongs so we can talk about the shared sense of facts that are relevant to people's lives and touch their lives how they feel it, we begin to restore trust. We begin to restore the common ground that we can then build policy on together. So that's what drew me to it, and that's what drew this very interesting ownership group to the paper, and we can talk about that later.
I had a certain feeling. There was a charge, there was an energy, there was an excitement in the newsroom. And over the years, I saw that excitement kind of go away, dissipate. What was your feeling when you walked in to the Sun-Times and took a look around the room? What did you see? And how did you feel?
Okay, so Mary knows this. So she's asking because she knows the answer to this. Like a good journalist, she knows the answer to this question. There were no women in positions of authority at the Sun-Times, really. There were very few people of color anywhere in that newsroom. And I came from a big consulting firm. I thought it was a problem there. And I was really deeply shocked by that. That was day one. It took a little longer to understand that the really fabulous people who were there were suffering from like post-traumatic stress disorder from 4 owners who pillaged the place. I mean, let's be clear. Trump Tower sits where the Sun-Times used to be, right? But I've found the documents. You know, there was a time when the ownership entered into a joint venture with the Trump company, and $78 million, and not much of it went into journalism. You know, but that's not unique to the Sun-Times. Look what's happening in Denver right now, you know, and it's actually not bad for the American economy that investors invest in businesses that are failing in order to take the resources out and put them into something more productive. That's why we're the most productive economy in the world, but at a cost, at a social cost. And can you put journalism out of business like a horse and buggy company? That's a real question.
So how do you change it when you talk about trust? You walk into a situation where people are, you know, demoralized, basically. You walk into a place where it's very obvious that there are not enough minorities, people of color, there are not enough women in positions of authority. How do you build trust from there?
Before I answer that, Mary, do you still think the place is as demoralized as it was?
Well, no. I think there is an energy in the Sun-Times that I haven't seen for a long time, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are now in the West Loop. Mm-hmm. There's a certain kind of energy there. The second thing is because you've made an effort. I will say that you made it. I'm not just saying that because you're the boss. But you have made an effort. We have a chief operating officer that's an African-American female. We have a comptroller. Never had a comptroller before. I didn't even know that, newspapers had comptrollers. That is an African-American female. You have hired African-American writers. So there is progress being made. But here's a point that I want to get to. If trust is a problem, not just at the Sun-Times, but just trust, period. There's a problem when it comes to trust between community and police officers. There's a problem when it comes between trust when it comes to elected officials and the citizenry. There's a trust with newspapers, period, whether it's the Chicago Sun-Times or the Tribune or the Washington Post or the New York Times. How do you go about rebuilding that trust?
Right. So internally, and Mary touched it, thank you, Mary. We have moved all the resources that we can from all parts of the company to journalism, right? So we have really shrunk, and we spend $2 million a year less than we did, but we're spending a lot more on journalists and journalism. That's just part one. You have to be able to do the job, and the people have to be good at it. And Mary's good at it, really good at it. Laura, who's here, is good at it. We really it's very important that our journalists know how to do journalism, because not everybody who can, get online does. But today, this trust question really also requires that every organization, not just journalists, but anybody, they have to know who you are. When you communicate with, again, I've said this before, I've been married a long time. And I knew my wife a long time before we got married. Sometimes we still misunderstand each other. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, but it happens, right? It's but how do you get over it? You have to know the entity, the person you're dealing with. So that's why, in the crass corporate world, that's called branding. But you have to live it. You have to be who you say you are. That's what this video that we'll show you is about. It helps you know who we are. And we talk about it all the time. We talk about it in the editorial board. We talk about it with the journalists, not because we direct the way we cover things differently. Although, you know what? The Sun-Times writes about a fire in a house, and they're going to write about it differently than the Wall Street Journal would. Right? The Journal will talk about the house burned down, and then they'll talk about issues of insurance and issues of refinancing the house and what that means for property values around there. And you know what? We're going to talk about the family. Right? Because, so even in something as clear as a fire, you have to know who you are and why you're doing this. And again, the highest mission we're so lucky, honestly. We are lucky because the best business strategy we have is also our highest calling. Namely, have the backs of the working women and men of Chicago. And if we do it, and we do it honestly, we rebuild trust, and we rebuild the business.
So, your role in the newsroom, how would you describe your role? Mm-hmm. How are you involved in how things get covered? Do you decide what gets on the front page as your predecessor did? Or do you leave it all up to the editor-in-chief? What's your management style?
So I am everywhere and into every piece of everything. But it's in the role of connector. I need communication is really hard and we are a startup because we started a whole digital news company that didn't exist after all. We should talk about the new products and that as well. We are a turnaround of a troubled business in a very distressed industry, and we're undercapitalized. Any one of those is a disaster, right? And we have all four. So communications is enormously important. And so I make sure that the parts all know about the other parts. And there was a time when advertising and journalism, because they made so much money, they could be separate as can be, right? But if Linda Yu is going to do a show on foods we love, the advertising guys have to know about it in order to sell sponsorships, right? Mary's doing a podcast. Right? Who in this day and age says, let's do a podcast about race relations in Chicago and try and have it be really honest? You know what? We did. And Mary's doing it. But it's okay to tell advertisers that. Because you know what? You got to get paid for it. Yeah, sponsor it. And by the way, if any of you want to sponsor it, I'm okay with that too. So the role I play, that's part of the role I play. The other part of the role I play is to demand that we play the role that I've talked to you about, that we actually be the company that I'm telling you we are, that we have the backs of working men and women. That doesn't mean I decide what's on the front page. I don't do that. I'm surprised by the front page sometimes. I even don't always like what we write. That happens. But I am determined that in every conversation, people know why we're here.
Well, did you expect when you walked in the door that there would be so much controversy involved with what gets covered and how it gets covered in the city of Chicago? And since you've been there, you've had a couple of controversies.
I did not have any naivete about the controversial things the press can do, right? And I knew it, and I've lived here all my life. I have, in part of my life, complained about things that have been written. So no, that wasn't a surprise. But yes, we've had our share of controversies, right? I mean, I'm sure everybody knows. We also run The Reader. The Reader ran a cover that was somewhat shocking, controversial, right? I hired a guy, I put him in the wrong, it was my fault. And I've said it. I hired a guy, I put him in the wrong job. I asked him not to do something, he did. and he's no longer there. You got to own it and move on. You know, that goes back to trust too. You know, everybody makes mistakes. Some of them are appalling. You have to work through it with people.
So it sounds to me like you think that newspapers should be the conscience, basically, of our city. That the newspaper has a role, as you say, in building community. How would you begin that process, or have you begun that process to build community by using the Chicago Sun-Times and the resources of the Chicago Sun-Times?
Yeah, what few resources we have. I think you're right in that building community is essential to building trust, right? So it starts with being honest about who we are, and then going out and talking to people like this, which I do a lot, about who we are. But we also now have events, you know, and those events are also about who we are. We have events that connect people to stories they say they're interested in. So that's also a revenue stream. And I'm eager, hint, we're having digital subscriptions. It's not going to give it away for free anymore because, you know, Mary needs to eat, right? We got to pay people.
That's for sure.
So we're going to ask you to pay something for those digital subscriptions. And I didn't do it on day one because we had to make the products better. We just did. And the digital side in particular had to be better before we asked people to pay for it. But that's building community. I need Chicago to decide they need a Sun-Times. And if we decide this together on these terms, that our reporting is going to be about working people of Chicago on how policy and politics and the weather and sports, what that means for people who live here. Now let's just take the arts for a second. So one of these controversies Mayor's talking about, a wonderful theater and music critic left the Sun-Times. I let her leave. And not because she isn't great. I've been a fan of hers for years, but because the idea of criticism wasn't what we need. You know, theater critics have a tough job, and it was a tough job when there was a canon, when I could say, I've seen that play 12 times, and you know, the last time I saw it, they acted this way. But now theater's much more diverse. It's much harder to be that kind of great critic when everything's diverse, right? And the other thing is, nobody was reading it. You know, what I want to do instead, and what we've started to do, we brought back a paper product called Weekend Plus, and we've added digital products. So I go to the Lyric Opera with a videographer. I don't go, they go. And they go into the costume room and they say, this is the Queen of the Night's costume. How cool is that? And they talk about that. And then they talk up to young opera singers about what they want to do. Or a school group goes to the symphony, and they talk to the school group about what the symphony's like. And suddenly we're connecting people to arts, and there are 250-some theaters in Chicago. We couldn't do that with criticism. We can do it this way. So we ran an editorial that Mary was part of, helping do, that talked about how one theater actually changed a neighborhood in Chicago. Right? So that's the kind of coverage that we like, and it's different. Those choices are hard to make. They're doing things differently, but we think they're more fair to the city.
So when you see a well-known and acclaimed critic leave, and her column with her, it doesn't bode well in the minds of other people who are involved in either critics or even columnists. And it also raises questions about what is the future of print. You're talking about, you know, going with a video camera and taking pictures and doing this and going behind the scenes, but there's still a print product. And we've been wondering for years now, what is the future of the print product? Do you see a day when there is no print product for the Chicago Sun-Times, that is all on these different platforms?
Okay, so multi-parts. The critic left. And yet, we then built an entirely new print product, one that had been gone for a long time, called Weekend Plus, which now covers entertainment in a way that sometimes hasn't in a long time, right? So we were able to do more traditional print reporting on entertainment. So we doubled down in some ways. The role of print is a little different. I get the New York Times, right? My Sunday New York Times experience used to be, cup of coffee, I'd sit down, I'd spend a couple hours, people would leave me alone, I'd learn a whole bunch of new things. Now I get it, and I go, read that one, read that. Didn't read that, that's good. Oh, I haven't done the puzzle. Read that, read that, read that, read that, read that, right? By the time it shows up. So we have to understand, and it isn't just the Sun-Times, everybody's trying to figure out what's the role of print, what's the role of digital, how do they work together? So we did this rebranding in part so that our website and our paper can work together. And we have, and I'm not announcing here, but we're going to have some interesting changes in that regard. In the
And
next,
I missed that. In
Yeah.
what regard?
Yeah. But print isn't going away anytime soon, I don't think. I hope not. I'd like my printing contract to go away and get one that's a little less rough.
Do you think, or what do you think about the mix, the landscape, and the right mix for in terms of journalism for the Chicago area? What's missing? We know you got the Tribune, you got the Sun-Times, you got the Defender, you got the Crusader, you got a bunch of local DNA left, so they're out the picture. What do you think is missing?
About 400 more journalists would be nice. Look, Chicago is enormous, and it's interesting, and it's interesting everywhere. And the real challenge when you're, short on staff is how do you tell all the stories that matter? How do you do the job that the democracy needs done? We're all struggling to figure out a financial model that is sustainable. Right? We've thought about doing the Sun-Times as a nonprofit. It turns out you can't change it to a nonprofit fast enough to make that happen with the law. So, we are a nonprofit, let's be honest about that. And we will be that way as long as we're in business. But it's really missing. There are lots of stories that don't get covered. We cover City Hall, sort of. All of journalism covers it, sort of. And I think Fran is spectacular at what she does at City Hall, but having once been an alderman, I know there are other stories there. And that's just City Hall where people pay attention. How about 3/4 of the neighborhoods in Chicago? Now, we are going to do a new neighborhood series, and I'll tell you about that, called The Grid. We're going to go into every neighborhood in the city and some of them in the suburbs and say, almost like, well, let's just talk about what we would do here if you came spend a day. You don't live in the neighborhood and you wanted to see it for a day. And we're going to tell you, where do you eat? Why would you rent a house here? Would you rent a house? Would you buy an apartment here? What would make you want to do that? What are the schools like? What do you do for fun? We're going to actually do that in all of the neighborhoods because I love Chicago. And the journalists who work at the Sun-Times love Chicago. And you read any of the papers for a whole year, and you're left with thinking, why would anybody love this city? Right? It's just not right. So we want to be. Every story can be fair and accurate and balanced, and the weight of them over the course of the year leaves you with the impression that, who would live here? And the truth is that's not good journalism either. That doesn't build trust because people then think it's not authentic. So we're going to have different set of products that balance the news we must tell, after all, with the news, with the life we see.
Okay, but what is the right balance? And this question comes up quite a bit, and especially early in my career, I used to go out and there were a lot of complaints about you write too much about murder, you write too much about bloodshed, and if it bleeds, it leads, and that sort of thing. But if you're writing about all these wonderful things that's happening in the community, if you're writing about those things, where are the stories that really look at and hold accountable the policymakers and the people who are really empowered to make life better for people who live here?
Right, and those are the stories that we do. Those are stories that we do well, and we could do more of them, but that's the part that we haven't, the 400 new journalists that we need all over Chicago, some of them will do that, and then they'll do these other things that we need. The Sun-Times, after all, 15 days ago, broke a story about how filthy CPS is. Our work led to the hiring of 200 new janitors so the kids don't have to be in that filth. That's the kind of, we're holding people accountable, and we do it. We spent a lot of real estate on a suburban volleyball coach so that girls wouldn't be abused. And he's no longer in that business. So we do that kind of journalism. That's part of the Sun-Times DNA, and it will always be part of the Sun-Times. As long as there is a Sun-Times, it'll be part of its DNA.
Okay. And now on to Q&A.
Thank you, Edwin, Mary. You sort of let in, one of the things that from a local community point of view that really was terrible was losing DNA, because they covered the local communities. And all the reporters would work with the community leaders and get stories. And there are a lot of times I would call up the local reporter, something I couldn't find out. I said, Todd, you ought to go call so-and-so and find out. And then we'd find out what was going on. So one of my questions is, how do you determine, or will you look to maybe make up for that absence of DNA to start focusing on more local stories? And then the corollary question is, how do you determine what major stories you're going to cover in depth? And do you have someone on the staff who's an architecture critic, who's an urban affairs critic? And if not, do you look to do that to get people that can concentrate on long-term stories in addition to covering every day?
Alan, we also hired as many DNA people as would come when they shot. And we offered blanket opportunities to those journalists, more than we could afford. And many of them, really talented people, are working at the Sun-Times now.
Hello, my name is Elaine Hyde. I'm the publisher of New East Side News. On the topic of local community news, here's a local newspaper of the New East Side. And the reason I show this is because we are trying to fill that void that DNA info left. But you see, I have access to a lot of people who are writing stories for me for almost free because they live in the community, and I run it very cost effectively. But the problem is, obviously we are trying to grow ourselves. And my question to you is, how do we reach out to someone, to the Chicago Sun-Times, if we want to do partnerships to broaden the reach of your articles, broaden the stories from us going to you that you could cover? How do we communicate? Like, I know I've sent a couple of emails to a couple of writers, but I don't know where they go. So who is it?
So we are, and it's a very good question. And it's a very good question, and did you all hear it in the back? Okay, so there are a couple parts to it that make it complicated. Everybody's a little overworked. In your shop as well. We try and do community partnerships with different community news organizations. And Chicago is a remarkable place for community news. And it's happening in lots of places, and we go talk to them, and we try and help where we can, and we do partnerships where we can. We are also, constrained is the wrong word, but I have a contract with my journalists, and I pay them per the contract, and that contract does not allow me to replace them with free labor, right? And that is also an important standard for all of us. The work of journalism is enormously hard and underfunded, and you guys do it for love and for patriotism in the neighborhoods that you live in, and it's not sustainable forever that way. We're trying to come up with a solution that's sustainable for Chicago, where the journalists get paid, and they get paid a wage they can live on, and that they want to work for, so they can do the really hard job of holding CPS accountable when they don't want to tell us what's going on, right? So yes, we work with community organizations, and not many and not as often as we should, but given our own constraints, we do reach out and try and partner with some of the fabulous community journalist organizations in Chicago. Up to you.
Okay.
I have too many friends in the room.
Thank you for the opportunity. The challenge, it seems, is with your new strategy is how do you identify whether or not you're aligned with your readers? And I'm wondering what you find are going to be the most important metrics that you'll measure over the next 5 to 10 years that will prove to you that you're succeeding. And I got to imagine it's not subscribers anymore, so just curious.
Well, if we are alive in 5 to 10 years, we've succeeded. The knife is at our throat. I want you guys to understand we could go away. We really could. It's that dire. And it is subscribers, but digital subscribers. They're different revenue streams. I mean, we don't want to get too much into the business model of journalism, but print subscribers are not the future revenue stream for any news organization in the United States, at least. Those numbers continue to go down, and ad revenue associated with it goes down even faster, and it has for everyone. It's been replaced in lots of places. The New York Times, it's a good example, with digital subscriptions. Basically, people who say, there's a community I want to be part of, and it includes journalism, and they subscribe. So digital subscription revenue, digital ads, events that we are running that are bringing in a good chunk of revenue for us, sponsorships for certain kinds of content where that's appropriate are all important. Those are the economic metrics. There are other kinds of metrics, as you can imagine, given how we've talked about this, that we'll consider. Do people stop arguing about what a fact is, right? Because they've trusted us to tell them these are the facts so that they can then decide what are the policies we should build on those facts. That would be fabulous. I mean, I would consider that a home run in the United States. Not just Chicago. I do think if we do this right, well, let me tell you about our ownership group for 1 second. It's related. So I wanted to get a team together to rescue this paper, given its DNA, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't elite. I went out to organized labor, and they said yes. So today, the group that currently is investing is wealthy individuals, restructuring professionals, bankers, lawyers, a journalist or two, wealthy individuals, but also carpenters, beer vendors, home health care workers, window cleaners, crane operators. And this was dues money, not pension fund money, right? So today, if in this building, was probably not built by them because it's too old, but the building across the street, built, maintained, cleaned by the hands of the people who own the Sun-Times, right? So I love that Chicago's the kind of city where wealthy individuals and people who care about the city and organized labor can come together for a civic cause like this. This hasn't happened in any other city in the United States. So give yourself a round of applause because the coming together started here and it hasn't happened anywhere else.
Hello. Hi, I'm Bridget from Canon Design. So you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned bringing video into the Opera House to film the costumes and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit more about how the Sun-Times is using visuals and storytelling and how you see that progressing moving forward?
Sure. Work in progress, because no one completely has it figured out. But one of the greatest talents we got was from DNA Info, a guy who's fabulous at making graphics. And now we have a motion graphics person, because when people do the stuff online, it helps to tell stories that way. And so we have those capabilities, we didn't have them. In terms of video, our videos support the stories. We have some great stories where we also follow our journalists and show the story of them reporting the news. And then we have a feature where we actually, and Mary's been part of this, where we actually interview journalists on, well, how did you make those decisions? Well, Mary just did one on how we covered the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death. And you should go on our site, find it, and look at it. It's beautiful. It really helps people, talk about build trust, understand how and why we make the decisions we make about what gets covered.
And so we're back to hardest working, because this is an experiment in a lot of ways. We've never done this before. I write my story, I file my story, I go home to my family. I don't have to write my story, go run and find a videographer, go find some makeup, try to, get it together, to go out to shoot video and talk and be all of a sudden now I'm an anchor. That is the future. And so while we are so appreciative that we were rescued, the people that work there, the hardest working journalists around, they're learning and struggling on their own to work in this new environment because it's a partnership. While Edwin is out there trying to, get subscribers, we are out there trying to deliver on what he is promising to those subscribers. So it's an experiment.
Hi. So I moved here I'm a transplant, and when I moved here, there was a man named Eugene Sawyer was mayor. It was a very interesting time to move to Chicago in the interruption of the Daley administration, I guess is the way we're supposed to refer to it. And every cab I got in and out of had a Sun-Times in it. Everybody told me cab drivers read the Sun-Times. I'll never forget it. Went to work at a little shop called Edelman, started doing PR. Fast forward a few centuries, it feels like, and I work in transportation. And I used to know who the Sun-Times reporter was. She came. First she was full-time, then she was part-time. I saw an ad a few months ago for a transportation reporter. I have no idea who to pitch. I know who to call at the Trib, or email, or text, or heck, Twitter, or respond to her video. And I'm Candid, Cranes, everybody, not the Sun-Times. So I guess I would say to you, help us be your sources. Help us know where to go. Yesterday, you guys had a piece. If anybody else had it, I didn't see it, about this crazy thing about Rauner's campaign and Blagojevich's wig and the... I read it. I thought it was The Onion. I couldn't imagine it was real. Anyway, I put it in my Facebook... Oh, I've been turned off. I put it in my... I'm sorry. I put it in my Facebook post. Person said, did anybody else see this? Not one person responded. I was shocked. Who's reading this? That was an I literally thought it was a joke. I thought it was April Fool's. Anyway, that's my comment. Keep going. We're rooting for you.
Thank you. Write the editors. Write Chris Fusco, write Carol Fowler, right? Because they'll find somebody for those stories.
Hello. One of the reasons why I subscribe to print news is to get the backstory behind the headlines that are on the evening news on the television, or even the headlines that are come up on my Google searches. And I have gotten the impression that the Sun-Times sometimes feels more like a headline than the backstory. I read a story, an article, and I think, where's the rest of it? And even on the digital media, the stories that I find the most satisfying and informative are those that first appeared in print and were, in fact, in-depth. Most of the stuff on the electronic media is still headline-oriented. And I'm still looking for the backstory on a lot of issues.
No question in there.
No, we can do, look, we're
Hi.
a work in progress. Right?
I'm Lori Glenn, and I work in communications for many years. And so I work with the Great Cities Institute, and we had this awesome program about 50 years later. The Kerner Commission came back. This man who I was so lucky to meet wrote a book about how, sadly, we've gone backwards in terms of civil rights. I think we don't need to be told that. And, you know, I was trying to get this story out. So I work with Teresa Cordova. She's awesome. And so I'm trying to get the story out, and there were a lot of people I talked to, but there was one person, she's sitting up there, and I called her, and you know, she scares me sometimes, it's true, she's tough, and I've had her say no to me, but I've had her say yes to me many times, and frankly, she didn't, I'm sorry, sir, write a headline. She wrote a really beautiful column that kicked off a series of other than stories that we were able to garner. Yes, we are Think Inc. But what I'm talking about is that sometimes, you know, I get frustrated too. There are times I call and I'm like, seriously, please write this. But I think we as a community, I really want to say this, and it's true, I've known Edwin, we grew up together sort of, but let's just give them a round of applause because at least we've got 2 papers in town still. So thank you. I mean it, seriously.
Okay, the next one has to be a question.
And I had such a good speech prepared, too. I was struck by the video, which gives a very clear message of we're the paper for you and they're the paper for them. And you've got to pick up, you know that you need to build trust in your community. We all applaud that. Is it too much to hope, and does the media have any role in building trust between communities, building bridges between communities? How do we make Michigan Avenue read the Sun-Times? Because if those of us who want one community need to know what's in the Sun-Times, and the other way around. I would ask the same question to your competitors as well. Is there a role for the newspapers to do that?
We build, yes, and I think we're doing it, and I think, though, and I want to go back to what I said before, a cornerstone of trust is knowing with whom you are dealing, right? And I think if we are who we say we are, through and through, and we have the backs that we promise we're going to have, some of my investors are very wealthy, and some of my friends are very wealthy. They actually want to know what's going on in the whole city, right? If we pretend that we're somebody else, and then we want a little bit of this and a little bit of that, we're not honestly building those bridges. So I think it's okay to say, this is who we are it proudly, and you're welcome to come in. We'll tell you the stories, we'll listen to you. You know, our editorial board, people come to us all the time. Developers come to us, the Obama Library comes to us. We've heard from, you know, people who you wouldn't think working men and women are their bread and butter, but they have a story to tell and they want us to hear it and to make a judgment about whether we'll support them or not, and we do make that judgment. And we think we make it fairly, but everybody has to know us. I think that's, you know, we endorsed Bruce Rauner in the Republican primary last time, even though a lot of people said you should, my partisan friends said, why don't you just have pox on all their houses and be a Democratic paper, right? But we won't do that because that's not true to the group that we say we are supporting. So I think in answer to your question, I'm proud of that video. I think it says who we are, and I think it says you know who we are, so we can be an honest partner in building those bridges.
I didn't mean to criticize the video.
No, it was a great question.
Build on strength,
Yeah.
then reach out.
Yes.
But part of it is, and this is culture of newsroom, is that newsrooms are very, very, very competitive places. We get our juices flowing by competing with the Tribune. If there was no Tribune to compete against, I don't know what we would do.
And I don't want to put them out of business. I really don't.
That's
I
what
just
we
want to
do.
push them to Lake Forest where they belong.
Okay, so hello. I've got a question. I'm a former newspaperman in Chicago, and I subscribe to the Sun-Times every day and Sundays.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm really find it disingenuous that this crowd doesn't. And I would just like to say the reason I do is because for the past several years, it is by far a superior newspaper product. The Tribune is not, it's just not there. The Sun-Times covers the city. There is Novak, you have the best columnists, it goes on and on. And so I think that the product as it is really important. And I'm not so fond of the community notion going forward because there needs to be a voice on the big stage. My question, though, is one of the great things about subscribing to the Sun-Times was getting the Washington Post online as part of the subscription. By the way, you want in-depth? Fine, subscribe to the Sun-Times and you'll get the Washington Post and you won't get any deeper depth than that. So my question is, will that keep going?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I certainly don't know the answer to that is yes yet. You know, that is a negotiation.
Okay, this is our last question.
Hi, my name is Ellie Barmasel, and I like to think I'm a funny person, and they say brevity is the soul of wit, so let's get right to it. Here is my question for you, Edwin and Mary. When we think about the digital divide, and we know that there are fewer and fewer people who have access to online in a sustainable way, how does that impact the spread of information, and how does that impact the Sun-Times' ability to do their job?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of great studies about digital divide in Chicago. It's real. It's one of the reasons why print isn't going away, right? But a lot of people who suffer from the digital divide also don't pick up the print paper, right? So we are doing our best to get our news out in every way we can, in every medium we can think of that we can afford. And we talk about the digital divide. I mean, that gets at a policy question, which, to bring it full circle, if we can get on the same set of facts as a country, we can start to deal with the really difficult questions of urban planning, of planning for pensions, for gosh sakes, of dealing with questions of race and in Chicago and in our state, of dealing with opioid problems that are enormous in our state. We don't actually get there around the politics. Very hard. So that's why this is so fundamentally important, and why I want your help. I want to build a community where you guys support us to help build the platform upon which we can have the discussions that are as important as your question, even though it was funny and brief. Really important stuff. And your work, Mary Sue, at MPC is really important for Chicago. But how do you get there if we're not on the same page about who we are and what the set of facts are? Thank you all.
So I just want to, Edwin, I can't let you go without asking you this last question. From one of your employees at the hardest working paper in America, when do I get a raise?
I don't think that was practiced, but that was very theatrical. Thank you so much, Mary and Edwin. It was a delight to have you here as our guests. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. I had a chance to say hello to some of you as you walked in. We do these occasional urban think and drinks, which I know some of you, this is your first time. Can I see a show of hands for first timers? Great. We've been getting that like 25 to 50% new at each event. So if we keep that up, we get great ideas for these events from all of you. So please catch one of us. Another show of hands just of the Metropolitan Planning Council staffers. So if you see someone around the room that you can, yes, let's thank them. And we're all available to chat afterwards. We consciously leave a little time at the beginning and the end so you can have a chance to meet someone new. So if you're not on our mailing list, make sure that you drop off a card so we have your full contact information. We do send out invites to events all the time. I want to promote one that's just coming up next Monday. We partner with other organizations, and next Monday, the 23rd, we are at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs at their facility, featuring two authors, Bruce Katz, formerly of the Brookings Institution, and Jeremy Nowak, who co-authored a book called The New Localism, talking about the devolution of power from the federal government down to the local levels and what that means for cities driving everything from climate change policy to economic policy across the board. So you can register online on our website or on the council's website for that. And as you visit with people, this postcard is meant to give you a couple of conversation prompts. In addition to, many people took us up on the suggestion of putting their neighborhood on their sticker of their name card. So please use that to get to know someone new. Mary and Edwin, you both gave us a lot to think about tonight about our responsibility as citizens, as contributors to queuing up issues, as well as to partnership across the sectors. We take that seriously at MPC. We want to be your partner on content. We've started some conversations with the Sun-Times about how we can do that more proactively as we put out data about the state of the region. Our research director, Alden Lowry, is hanging over there. So he's working on a lot of these metrics about understanding how we stack up. And we hope that's one of the reasons why you come to MPC, to learn about what is this about the metro region and Chicago and Illinois landing in last place, again, third year in a row, and growing places. Why is that happening? What's happening with Mexican immigration dropping? What's happening with the Latino population moving out to the suburbs, or the loss of middle class and poor African Americans from the city? Where are they going? What does all this mean for the efficiency of our governments? Is it true we have 7,000 units of local government? Yep, it's true. And we have to tackle each and every one of these issues. So we're big believers in our assets in the region, but that we haven't connected them and deployed all of the talent that's represented in the room today. So we are very proud to work with you in partnership to do these occasional events to hopefully recharge the batteries. You helped us do that tonight, but also to commit to doing the work ahead. So please continue to give us your ideas, use our information, pass it on, bring a friend to a next event, and we look forward to making this the most competitive, equitable, sustainable, and fair region any place in the United States. Thanks again.